Hello and welcome to all attendees. We are going to be beginning the seminar in just a few minutes. We're going to wait for a couple more attendees to arrive. So hold tight, and if you wouldn't mind just reading this introductory slide, and we'll be with you in a minute or two. Thanks. Great. Hello all, and the panelists, if you can turn your videos and your microphones on, we'll begin right now. Great, and let me turn off that. Great, and we are ready to go. Thanks for waiting.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this online discussion, which is a part of a series organized by Oxford Refugee Study Center and Global Refugee-led Network. And the series name is By Refugees Strengthening Refugee-led Humanitarian Response During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As I can see, there's so many participants attending this our online discussion, and we are so happy to have you here. And before going to our discussion, let me tell you my name. My name is Anila Noor, and I'm representing here as a co-moderator for this session. And I will give it hand over to Andonis, who will share the house rules, and then I will go to the today's discussion topic, and I will like to introduce our very good presenter who are waiting on the other side of the world, and I'm looking forward to have a great discussion today. Yes, Andonis. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Anila. I just want to share with you all some of the standard protocols to make this call go as smoothly as possible. To let you know that the seminar is going to last for about an hour and a half, which we'll try to divide roughly equally between 50 minutes of commentary from the panelists, and then another 40 minutes with question and answer session and some comments from all of you on the other side of the chat box. In order to facilitate that, if you want to insert your questions in the chat, which you can find as a feature at the very bottom of the Zoom screen, you're welcome to then change the blue option of sending to all panelists and participants so that everybody is able to see what you have to share with us tonight. Unfortunately, a feature of the Zoom webinar platform is that all attendees are not able to see one another. So if you also want to use that space to introduce yourselves, share any links, that's a good opportunity to connect with one another and have ongoing conversations throughout the chat and after this presentation as well. We are very glad to have increasing interest in the seminar series. We have about 500 people who have registered, more than that, and a broad cohort of folks from the refugee, IDP, stateless communities, many staff within UNHCR throughout the globe, a large network of academics globally as well, and many different folks that are representing different AI NGOs, think tanks, and other organizations throughout the world also. So there's quite a broad audience that the panelists are going to speak to tonight, but we're very interested in exploring different areas that we can delve into in greater detail. So please do share your comments, and we will begin this session with Anila's introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I share, my name is Anila Noor, and originally I'm from Pakistan. Now I'm living in Netherlands, and myself, I'm a refugee. And from last few years, I've been quite actively involved in the advocacy for the refugee meaningful participation on the global and European level, because being a refugee, we felt there's a missing voices in the debate of policy, but that's what we are trying to do. And today's topic, which is the new partnership, how international organizations supporting refugee-led organization, is very close to my heart, too close to my work. So I'm so excited to introduce our panelists, Dana and Edmund. So I will request Dana to first introduce herself, who is now in Qatar, I think. And then I will request Edmund to introduce himself, and then we can start this discussion. Over to you, Dana. We are so excited to have you here.
Thank you guys for having me. My name is Dana Anzy. I am working at UNHCR with the Partnership and Coordination Service as part of the Division of External Relations. I am originally based in Geneva, but unfortunately due to the COVID situation, I am back home now in Qatar, where I am speaking to all of you through technology and so on and so forth. And I greatly look forward to the discussion that we're about to have today.
Thank you, Dana. So Edmund, if you could introduce yourself. I can't see you. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. Okay. Oh, yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Edmund Page from Xavier Project. It's a great privilege to be involved in this webinar series. I found the first two webinars fascinating, and it's exciting to build on the discussions from the Global Refugee-led Network, as well as last week's presenters. Xavier Project, we work in Kenya and Uganda primarily with refugee-led organizations. We're about 25 staff members spread across the two countries. We started off working in education, and we still do quite a lot in education, because a lot of the refugee-led organizations we partner with are in working in education themselves, often community-led education. So we started off primarily education, went into livelihoods and enterprise, and then about 5 years ago pivoted to be working primarily with refugee-led organizations. In terms of our work with the way we partner with refugee-led organizations, we'll talk about that in more detail a bit later on. Yeah, thanks.
Brilliant. And from my end, thank you both for joining us at the Refugee Studies Centre. I think what's really exciting about this seminar is we're moving to look at the question of partnerships. We've heard extraordinary stories from a number of refugee-led organisations working in urban areas in the last seminar, from the Global Refugee-led Network around the world in the previous seminar. And I suppose the question is, having heard from those seminars that there's a need for partnership, a need for recognition and funding, now we can explore the role that UNHCR can play and the role that international NGOs can play. So I wondered if you could both tell us a little bit about what your organizations are doing in their work with refugee-led organizations. And Dana, perhaps we could start with you, because in a way your role is a very exciting and new one within UNHCR. You're a focused person for the engaging work with refugee-led organizations, and you've been working on a really exciting mapping study on behalf of the organization. So could you both tell us, starting with Dana, a little bit about the work you're doing with RLOs?
So having started not too long ago with UNHCR in November, I started working on the portfolio of RLO partnerships and how that's supposed to look or could look. And it started off with a mapping and a report. I've had very exciting consultations with a lot of refugee leaders, activists, and the global refugee-led network themselves. And it kind of started to piece together a dialogue that we're having right now. And this is why I feel like everything is kind of falling into place. Through the report itself and through the mapping, I have discovered challenges that RLOs face, and internal challenges that we need to discuss and kind of overcome internally in order to a better partner, better understand RLOs. And from there as well, we have come up with a mapping for as best as we could. There's a lot happening out there, so it's impossible to encapsulate that with a one-man show of any kind. But I try to the best of my ability to kind of capture what the work that is being done on a field, a national, regional, and global level by RLOs. And that is, in some, my report and my study, it is still under revision, and I remain open to hearing from my fellow panelists, from Anila, and from anyone in the chat box if they have any ideas on how to better partner with RLOs and with UNHCR.
Right, Edmund.
So, firstly, we have been developing over time what we call a capacity strengthening and sharing course, which we've been delivering with 12 RLOs across Kenya and Uganda, both urban and in camp and settlement settings. And we've so far got 9 modules for that, and planning 18 in total or more beyond maybe. And we have a manual. The idea is it's delivered by a facilitator who could be anyone, but so far is Xavier Project staff members. And the key focuses around sharing and facilitating rather than it being didactic, or, you know, because the way we've developed it has largely been through collating experiences and having inputs from the 12 refugee-led organizations that we've worked with, and pretty much all the content has come from their experiences. So we've been able to pull that together. During COVID, we've converted pretty much all of it already into podcast formats, and both of these are open source, so we can share, and, you know, we're always keen for inputs. Beyond that, that course, we and I could talk more about the specifics of, you know, what we think is important in that later. But with 6 of the 12 refugee-led organizations, we have a fairly comprehensive partnership. Some of the features of that, I think the most important is that we're in it for the long run with them. In some cases, we've partnered with them for 5 years or more. We've seen them go through the highs and lows and challenges, as we have too as an organization. So we've sort of lived that alongside. We also engage in activities with them. So in some cases, we've gone into consortiums where we've had funding to implement alongside them, and as a result, we have staff working side by side. So it's been a shared experience in that regard. We've also, in terms of financing and funding, we've been able to fundraise with them and for them. So an example of that, we recently fundraised for an egg incubator for one of our RLO partners in Southwest Uganda, which the funding pretty much went directly to them. And, you know, so there's that side of it. We also have been able to generate funding to give unrestricted grants or institutional support to the 6 that we have a comprehensive partnership with as well. I think for us, really the key thing that comes through all the time in the capacity and other work is around sustainability. And so funding is always key to that, but that's where our enterprise experience has been relevant, because in a lot of cases, sustainability for the RLOs comes in the form of some kind of enterprise. You know, sustaining purely through funding proposals is very difficult for a refugee-led organization in most cases. So having that enterprise side of it, or some form of income generating through their work, has been really helpful. And so that is nearly always a factor. And I think in terms of the partnerships going forward, a lot of the investment that we're trying to put in is in those kind of sustainable projects, which also has a bonus in other ways in terms of host community relationships and engaging in the local economy and other things that I think are related to refugee-led humanitarian response in terms of refugees integrating and contributing to the local economies. So that's a bit of what we've been doing.
Great, thanks for that, Edmund. I think that your response just now has touched on the second question, so maybe we'll start with Donna on this. We're curious to hear a little bit more about what is distinct about INGOs as compared to RLOs. Edmund has explained sort of how Xavier Project relates very closely with RLOs on the ground. What is UNHCR doing? What is your unit specifically tasked with regard to RLOs? And what are some of the principles of partnership that you all have?
So to begin with, if I can answer the question of what is the difference between INGOs and RLOs, through my research, what I have found to be one of the most distinct differences is the capacity of being registered. A lot of them have difficulties that INGOs don't usually face, and registration is definitely one of them. Sometimes it's more of a relationship that requires, or a partnership that requires, capacity building as well. To enable RLOs to better lead the communities that they're serving and become stronger at the responses that they are offering. Besides that, it is also looking at the capacity of delivery. INGOs, just by definition, are international NGOs, non-government-led organizations, international non-governmental organizations. And what they do is they operate on global, regional, and local level, whereas RLOs are usually more grassrooted, more embedded within the community. They have a stronger response system with regards to being a part of the community that they're serving. Those are just main distinct features. It does not go to say that one should take the role of another, but rather they all have distinct roles to play. And it is about strengthening these roles and making sure that they both receive the support and the efficiency that they require to come up with a solid output. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, great. And Edmund, do you have anything to add to that response?
Yes, I think it's a good question. I would imagine that in theory, there shouldn't be any difference between a refugee-led organization and an international NGO or institution. And actually, there are some great examples of refugee-led organizations being international. Too, I can think of L'Africana, based in Nairobi, also have a project in DRC, and RAI in Kakuma also have a branch in the US. So there are examples, you know, and many more that are growing in the same way. So in theory, there shouldn't be any difference. But as Dana mentioned, in practice, that's not the case. And there are some very concrete barriers that are preventing refugee-led organizations from maybe doing some of the same work. I think one that Dana mentioned was legal aspects around registration. Also in terms of things like owning assets. In many countries, refugees can't own assets even, and often an organization, it will be the directors who really own the assets and they need to be citizens. So that can be a concrete barrier. I think another big difference, which is important to recognize, is that we're talking about organizations responding to humanitarian crisis as affected populations themselves. And that you know, is automatically going to have an impact and create a difference in the way they work. You know, the few examples you can think of would be the politics of trying to serve your community in a way that's unbiased or perceived to be unbiased, when there's right in your community, maybe in your families, there's so much tension. And that is not just difficult politically, but I think it's difficult in terms of psychosocial pressure on being a leader in that type of work environment. And that's normally not the case for an international organization that might have their headquarters well out of a crisis context. So there are barriers, and I think there's also a role that non-refugee-led organizations can play in this kind of work. And actually, I think we bring more people to this. And I think it's really great to see the momentum building around these events, and, you know, a recognition that there is more work to be done in this regard. But I think there's always more we can do. I think one example is just in terms of fundraising. Yes, if you're getting funding from institutional grants, then that might have been spent in a similar way. But if you're raising funds through maybe unrestricted, and we're lucky being UK registered, we can fundraise in the UK, and increasingly we're getting to the point now of about 50% of our income being unrestricted, which is hopefully you could say that is funds that wouldn't have gone to this type of work otherwise. So a non-refugee-led organization can continue doing that. But I think in terms of principles of partnership and how to make this work, there are a lot of good examples, there are a lot of bad examples. This is a new trend that I know we're going to keep discussing around localization, and large organizations realizing that the control of aid, decision making around humanitarian aid needs to be more localized, and it's proving very difficult. In 2016 there was a target of 25% of all funding being channeled through local and national humanitarian responders, and I think at the moment it's around 0.2%. No, sorry, it's about 2%, but for refugee-led organizations it's less than 0.2% of that funding. So it's proving elusive, and I think some of the things that Dana mentioned, and also in the last series, last webinar, Shazza talked very clearly about as well, is in terms, why is it proving difficult? And I know, we'll talk about that in a minute, but what we can think about, like in terms of what is the right way of working, I think we have to touch on other bullet points, not just on funding, but also aspects such as coordination, the principles of partnership, and crucially capacity, because I think capacity comes back into all of those, including partnerships, because I think refugee-led organizations need to have the platform and the advocacy to be able to lobby for more equal partnerships, and capacity to play a bigger role in coordination. So capacity does come into it, and the question of how we can strengthen capacity is definitely an ongoing question that hasn't been fully answered.
Thank you, Dana and Edmund. I think the points you are highlighting about, as Dana said, she also researched and did some collecting information about who are refugee-led organization, and the profiling is really important, and even the understanding in our experience in our work which we are doing, because we are part of refugee-led organization, we are part of a refugee-led initiative, but still we're facing the understanding. There's a huge gap of understanding to see refugee-led organization as a partner. So I think the topic which we are discussing is really important to understand, to take them not only as a member, because so far, because I'm based in European region, and here in European region is a very common practice. People do take refugee-led organization as a members, but do not take them mostly as a partner. So I think this discussion really helped them to give them as a value as a partner, and to create some kind of flexible structure, some kind of, as Edmund, you said, capacity building is really needed, and I think really, really important. So I would like to ask both of you, what do you think, why so far localization is so difficult to enact, and what has been achieved, and what efforts are going well or not? So I will start, Edmund, with you, and then Dana, if you could highlight your point of view.
Yeah, okay, so it's a really big question that goes even beyond, certainly beyond even working with refugees in terms of localization of humanitarian aid as a whole. I think I would go back to what I was just saying about capacity primarily, because in 2016, there was this culmination of thinking that had been going on for a long time at the World Humanitarian Summit, that there should be this move towards localization. But that was what was agreed. It was like, this is needed. It was the why had been covered, but not the how. And I think in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been much more work done on the how, and that's quite exciting to me, because I can see some of the initiatives coming being really effective, particularly around those 4 points of funding, capacity, partnerships, and coordination. But I think there's 2 extra points I have on this. One is that refugees often, I mean, localization is loosely defined, but local and national partners, refugee-led organizations are very often excluded from that. I mean, there's a huge difference between a large national NGO that might be based in the capital city, working in a refugee camp 10 hours drive away, compared to a refugee-led organization based in the community. I mean, which one is really local? And most of, when we talk about that funding, how much of it is going to large national NGOs, which aren't really that different from international NGOs. So I think we have to all push the agenda more for refugee-led organizations to be included in the dialogue on localization. I think that's still only beginning. I think secondly, when you look at the grand bargain and the moment there's 8 sort of main commitments that have come out of it that have been signed, at the top level of states and the large NGOs and UN organizations, there's localization, and then there's the participation revolution. And the participation one talks about affected populations being more involved in decision making, and there's been a lot of and not just decision making, the planning, implementation. There's been a lot of work done to sort of define what that means. And for me, it misses the mark in terms of in the participation. I think may even in this case, what we're describing be the wrong term. I think I would rather think of it as ownership of decision making, ownership of resources. And so in a way, the refugee-led organizations fall between the crack between localization going to the local national actors, and then the participation part, which is more about consultative. And I think we have to all do more to change that, to push. And I think this is what these webinars and these discussions are about, is finding where's the refugee-led part fit within that, and then working out how we can all advocate more and do more to bring it to the fore. So that answers the why I think it's been difficult, but I think it also, I also wonder whether the question, of localization is only half the question really, when it comes to refugee-led organizations.
Yeah, thank you. Dana?
Thank you, guys. Actually, this is the question I was most looking forward to. Allow me to start with what you opened with, Anila. You opened saying meaningful refugee participation really means a lot to me. And to be quite honest, this kind of determined the discourse for the entire conversation that we're having now. I'll just read an excerpt for you guys from the report that I'm working on, which has not yet been published. I know a lot of people are asking for it, but for the time being, it's still in draft mode. Hopefully it'll become a bit stronger, and I'm not even sure if it will be published, but allow me to read this one excerpt for you guys. Following up on, according to the UNHCR Manual on Community-Based Approach in UNHCR Operations, meaningful participation is an act referring to the full and equal involvement of all members of the community in decision-making processes and activities that affect their lives in both public and private spheres. Participation also requires that instead of informing and deciding for people, we listen to them. Our role is to facilitate discussions and analysis with persons of concern so that they can identify their own priorities and preferred outcomes. In essence, also participation was identified as a right and is essential for informed decision-making. It also went on and on detailing about how it enables UNHCR to draw on the insights, knowledge, capacities, skills, and resources of persons of concern. So it just goes without saying that the role of refugees and the role of meaningful refugee participation is essential. I think this should go without saying. It shouldn't even be discussed at this stage, right? Unfortunately, yes, I understand sometimes it has to serve, there has to be reminders, but it is a given. Beyond that, let's discuss how we can unpack localization. When you say something as broad as localization, people can interpret it in many ways. So what is a local actor? What is the difference between a local actor and a national actor? Where does refugees and refugee-led organizations fall into this? According to the Grand Bargain, which Edmund also discussed, localization does not only encompass refugee-led organizations. It also encompasses non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, and activists, academia, local actors. 64% of UNHCR partners are actually national partners. 64% of UNHCR partners are actually national NGOs. So that just goes to say that there is a lot of work on localization that's already being done. But the question is, how do we amplify the role of refugee-led organizations now to be better included, while also understanding that they are coming from the communities that are directly affected, like you said, Edmund. They do go through a lot. They don't have a reality that is separated from the one that they're dealing with to go back to. At the end of the day, they serve their reality and then they go back to it at home, and it's their living life reality. So how do we support them through their refugee experience, but at the same time, support them in bettering that experience for them, in serving the communities that they wish to serve? I think that is the question. If we want to talk more about localization, in 2019, UNHCR has well achieved its 25% of funding for local actors. But hey, we're saying less than 2% of that, or was it 0.02% of that went to refugee-led organizations? I think the important thing is for us to have a constructive dialogue where it is transparent from both ends, where both institutions acknowledge the restraints that they have in supporting refugee-led organizations. For example, if it's not a registered entity, legally acknowledged, it does not mean we cannot support it anymore and we just drop that, but what can we do to work together to better support? And what can an RLO do to better help that process? What can refugee representatives such as yourself, Anila, do to continuously bring that voice and that experience forward? What can the academic field, such as the one Alex is involved in, do to bring that voice and that advocacy of change and policy shifts forward? It's just a process. It's not impossible. So that's kind of my bit on localization, guys. Sorry, I think I took too long, but I got a bit passionate about it.
Maybe I could just jump in on that and agree with what Dan is saying. I think UNHCR in many ways are doing a really good job in shifting the focus on this. I mean, it's always going to be gradual when you're doing it at a huge scale. An example that I've seen in northern Uganda, and I think across Uganda and possibly other countries that's happening more often, is UNHCR contracts with implementing partners, which traditionally would have been nearly always large NGOs. Now looking at consortium options and having a larger NGO working with a refugee-led organization in terms of implementation, with budget lines for capacity and things. This is really exciting. It's happening just in the last couple of years. So I think it's important to recognize that obviously it's not just UNHCR, other large organizations are doing that kind of thing. Clearly there's still a long way to go, but I think it's good to recognize that this has started, and maybe we need to keep the momentum going.
I think this issue of localization and the barriers to it is a really important one. So I just want to follow up on this question before we move to the next. You've highlighted a series of constraints that have existed around capacity building, the registration or lack of registration of refugee organizations, the challenges of them not always being allowed within the host country's regulatory frameworks to even hold assets. But I'm wondering, at a political level and a political economy level, what are the barriers we need to overcome? So for both of you sitting in this position where you're trying to support a greater role for refugee-led organizations, but in a way you're in a position of bridging the organizations on the one hand with the donor community on the other hand. many of the conversations I've had with donor governments have said, we really want to engage with localization, but it's a struggle because there are risks. We've got to be accountable to taxpayers and citizens. What needs to happen for the funding model to change, to go from the kind of notional 25% commitment of the grand bargain to actually making that realistic? What needs to happen to enable UNHCR or the Xavier Project to be able to go out to donors and make a case to overcome the barriers experienced by donors and funders? And I think, Dana, what I really like about listening to you in this conversation is saying it's not about one organization. It's about a conversation, a dialogue, working together. So my question is really, how can we work together to overcome the barriers at the level of resources and funding? And I think that's particularly important because already reading some of the questions in the chat box, a number of people are saying, well, yes, talking is great, participation is great, but we need to unlock resources. What can we do to achieve that collectively? Whoever would like to go first.
I guess I'll go first with it. I understand the questions that I'm reading, and I can see them. They're right there on the sidebar. I understand where the questions are coming from with regards to enough talking. Let's start working. But I think it's important for us to also understand that once we unlock this, we have to unlock it correctly, because we risk losing a lot of credibility if we do it wrong. And in the past, I've heard a lot of stories through my research where things did go terribly wrong. Funding was no longer accounted for, or the refugee-led organization that was provided the fund could not be accountable for it or could not deliver. And to be honest, it affected both the security and the well-being of the organization, but at the same time, it fired back on donors. It's a chain that we need to better understand the restraints on each level of that chain before we can better implement it. But a little bit beyond that, I think, practically speaking, let's start sharing more of the best practices. Sharing concerns clearly, but also constructively, sharing best practices. I during my research, all I found was how things had not been going right. But when it came to me, when it came to the time for me to try to become innovative and try to capture what we can do, how we can move forward, there was good literature on it, but not too many. So I think just kind of coming up with innovative ways, instead of saying, this is your job, you should be doing it. Let's collectively start that dialogue and say, this is how we can do it, and come up with mechanisms that are constructive, that are safe, that are reliable, that are accountable for all parties involved, whether it is academia, whether it is the UNHCR and other institutions beyond UNHCR, whether it's the donor states who would love to get involved but are a bit worried about the constituents and what they would say when the money is not accounted for, or the donations that are given are not accounted for. I think that's a bit it from my end, and I'll add a bit later during the questions, but I hope that answered your question, Alex. Over to you, Edmund.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think that was a very important point to make, that this is a risky process, and people are putting themselves at risk by even taking on these roles of leading refugee-led organizations, and we have to be very conscious of the principle of do no harm. I think when it comes to the through funding mechanisms, there's Xavier Project, we're not the only organization thinking this way. Just a shout out to a few others who are doing similar work. Urban Refugees, Alps Resilience, Same Skies, and STARS Egypt, Refugee Solidarity Network. All those organizations and others are working with refugee-led organizations and are also doing the same kind of advocacy, that funding should be conscious of this type of work. Maybe with those kind of organizations playing a role within consortiums. That's something we've luckily, as Xavier Project, we've done in CACMA. In one consortium we're in, five other organizations, the only role that we're playing is on capacity strengthening with refugee-led organizations, while the other organizations are doing more of the implementation. So maybe more of that kind of thing. I think the reason that's been so elusive is partly to do with the 1-year fund grants, or even in some cases 3-month grants. So capacity strengthening takes a long time, and the funding has to be more, I think, sensitive to longer term funding partnerships, where because in our case it's taken up to 5 years for an organization to maybe be ready to take on institutional funding. And so those would be two. I think, having lobbying at the top level for with donor countries that funds should take into this humanitarian funding should take into account localization concepts is something that really, from my experience, still doesn't happen much. When it comes to the maybe hosting countries and policies, and just touching on that in your question, Alex, that's slightly different. And I think when it comes to policies that maybe affect things like registration and barriers to implementation of refugee-led organizations, my only real answer to it is a case of chicken and egg, whereby through success stories, it is shown the impact that refugee-led organizations can have, and not just in social work, but also enterprise, and that is been basically the only main examples I've seen of being able to break policy barriers, because often governments, they're mainly thinking about their constituents and their voters, of their opinions of refugee-led social work and enterprise. So you have to be able to show that there's a positive contribution. And as soon as that narrative changes, and we all know in virtually every country in the world, there's always that tension in that narrative. That's how policies can change and can become more progressive. And so this work will hopefully in the end will achieve that in reducing, and we're seeing that. I think the enterprise part is also really important because it impacts the immediate local economy, and you can point at, it's not just about what refugee communities are doing for themselves, but what are they doing for others, the host community around them, creating jobs and creating opportunities. When you can really get that narrative in there, then that's when policies start to become more progressive, and some of these barriers will come down.
Fantastic. Thank you, both of you, for those answers. The follow-up question I wanted to ask next was about COVID-19. We haven't really talked much about the pandemic. And the question, I suppose, is this a unique moment of possibility to transform the international humanitarian system to make it more engaged with refugee-led organizations? I mean, I realize COVID-19 will be introducing all kinds of challenges to the work that both of you do, and is in a way putting many refugee-led organizations at the front line by default. But to what extent is there an opportunity, precisely because of the need, to create lasting change and create different models of participatory governance? What does COVID-19 mean for your work?
I'll go first this time. So firstly, COVID has already shone a spotlight on the work that refugee-led organizations are doing, because in many cases other agencies have had to pull their staff out, and so, as has always been the case, refugee-led organizations have been shown even more clearly to be the first and the last responders. So that's brought it to the fore. I think for the people around the world who've never experienced a crisis like this, I think it's helping to sort of clear the view of what it must be like to be a refugee living in a permanent state of crisis. And not only the refugee hosting areas that I experience, I would describe as, in one way or another, being a permanent state of crisis. They're going through that anyway, plus COVID, which actually impacts them even more than the rest of the world. Yet they're doing even more than they were before to play a key role in their community. So there are amazing stories coming through, and we all need to share more of them, I think, to show what refugee-led organizations are doing. But maybe most importantly, I think this situation shows the urgency of change, of why we need to act now. This has been a problem in the humanitarian sector for ages, that there's never been enough funding And so part of the reason for localization is because it's more cost effective. And that's going to become even more of a priority now, because we've already seen donor countries deflecting funding away from refugee aid or refugee funding because of needs in their own countries, which is maybe, you can understand why they've chosen to do that this time. But I think there's going to be even more of a bottleneck on and a challenge around funding for the refugee context, and maybe there might be more displacement, hopefully not, but we don't know what the fallout is going to be. And so the urgency for changing the way that we carry out humanitarian aid, I think, is coming very stark in this situation, and this is why we've got to change, we've got to act now.
I'm gonna jump in. I just apologize. The call to prayer is in the background, so my voice might not be clear, but it's about to end. Just to jump in on the COVID response and what that has meant for UNHCR, I will not delve deeply into technical issues simply because that is not my area. That is not what I do personally with UNHCR. But beyond that, I think COVID-19 has been a catalyst in a way. It has really brought to light the importance of what RLOs and the local agenda is supposed to look like. Without a doubt, RLOs have been extremely active, most especially the GRN with Anila's representation as part of the response mechanism. It showed us how indeed the frontline responders are those from within the community when things are on such a sort of lockdown, and it has become a valuable opportunity to better understand that relationship, to better understand the work that they do, how they do it, what their mechanisms are. And to be very frank with you, on each level, the mechanism has been very unique. So for example, the field level has its own mechanism, which is unique to it, as opposed to the global level, which is also very unique and has its own unique mechanism of disseminating information, supporting, and so on and so forth. And those are things that are now becoming documented, whether it is through the articles that Alex and the GRN have also written, but also through our experiences with them at UNHCR. I have honestly interacted with a lot more RLOs since COVID than I have since November, which is quite a shock, seeing that I've been working on the report since then. It poses a valuable opportunity, and I think this is personally why I was so eager to participate in this dialogue today. It's the beginning of something. Does not say that it has not existed in the past, but it is the beginning of a new chapter for the whole world. So I think how we move forward from this moment on can really help be constructive and define what we want our partnership to look like. And yes, as I said, and I'll conclude with this, it is an opportunity, and moving forward is key.
I just want to add one comment, and thank you, Dana and Imad, for so far for sharing your views and perspective. Being a part of refugee-led initiative, we felt there's need of quite a gap of understanding, and especially COVID-19, the response we are working, we are generating. We found at GRN there's a confusion going on the donors level. They do not understand whom to fund, because the competition is quite high, and refugee-led, they are more active. They have lack of a structure, they do have a lack of system, but they do not have lack of understanding of their local realities. So I think this is the thing which we are trying to put and to create, to how to make this mechanism more constructive, and to keep this momentum going on. So that's what we are trying to do. So thank you so much, we are really enjoying. And yes, so Alex and Andonis, back to you, because we see so many questions and I don't know how to put all these questions within the limited time. So please feel free to ask the question. Yes.
Sure. So I think that we'll have one more question in this conversation, and then we'll transition over to Q&A, because as you note, there's a lot of interesting commentary that we'd like to get to. But let's use this final question as sort of a launching pad. Dana, you acknowledged that the COVID-19 response is quite catalytic for your role and for the international humanitarian fora more generally. The question broadly is, what are the next steps? In 5 months from now, where should we be, and what can actors like yourself at the international and regional levels do to support RLOs and take things forward? A second part of that question with regard to what happens next is addressed more proximately to the audience and sort of the network of attendees for this seminar series. There are a lot of people that want to be involved, and there are calls to share email addresses, which we will do at a later stage. But for the second question of what is next, how can those that are involved in this conversation take things forward and participate to sort of make the transformations that you're suggesting?
So just to speak to I have been keeping my eye out on the chat and trying to keep up as much as I can with the rich conversations that are taking place, and you know, constructive dialogue that's taking place. It's really warming my heart. But I think, just to answer your question, Andonis, I cannot foresee in 5 months what things will look like. But looking back at what it was 3 months ago or 4 months ago, since the pandemic started, we have come a long way. I mean, we have now established a strong line of transparent, open, supportive dialogue with refugee-led organizations, with the GRN, through myself with Jumpstart Refugees, headed by Mustafa Alio, with the Jakarta Refugee Network, and so on and so forth. But I think I will continue to be committed. I will continue to be open to this dialogue, and so will UNHCR through their work and through their efforts. And the fact that we are working on these reports, and we are trying to come up with innovative ways to bypass or tackle the challenges that RLOs face, or that the donors face, or that this entire system faces with regards to better supporting RLOs, is a statement in and within itself. But work is already being done, and I hope that it just continues to grow from here on.
I think the GRN, the Global Refugee-Led Network, was an idea that, you know, whose time had come, and I know there'd been some iterations of it previously, but clearly, you know, the momentum behind it now has been fascinating and really exciting. And I think GRN's presence at the Global Refugee Forum in December and their role there was an indicator of that, and also, you know, and I think, as Mustafa said in the first webinar, this, you know, still representation wasn't high enough, but it was a good change in some ways, to have such a strong presence from GRN at the Global Refugee Forum. The pledges, you know, that was an amazing process to watch. I think there are 1,400 pledges now, but going through them, they're quite a lot to read. But I could only find about 10 that explicitly referenced refugee-led organizations and the kind of things that we've been discussing. So even in the Global Refugee Forum, maybe this topic hasn't come to the fore enough. Also interesting looking at the pledges that there are quite a lot of coalitions and compacts and declarations and other sort of groups that have already come together, who then signed a pledge together. And one example I found was a compact on youth involvement in humanitarian responses, which is part of the Grand Bargain. And I think what I'm trying to say is that having other movements and even ideas such as declarations or compacts or commitments, whatever you might want to call it, of a very diverse group of people, even beyond the GRN, doesn't have to be mutually exclusive with the pledges of the Global Refugee Forum. I think we can still do more to advocate for the pledges to be implemented. But I think there could be room to build, for us all of us on this webinar today and others. And actually, I think it'd be important to continue diversifying the people we bring into these discussions, possibly including more around private sector and possibly, you know, media, humanitarian media and so on, just to grow the energy and the movement around this. It could be possible to think of something more concrete, even going beyond these discussions. That might be something similar to that compact on youth. It could be it may not have to be something as tangible as that, but it just to keep highlighting, because as I mentioned earlier on, that refugee-led responses do tend to fall between the cracks, I think, of some of the movements and the existing networking that's going on, or sort of groups of people discussing work streams and things. I think that there's a gap there that a refugee-led network is definitely filling that gap in many ways. But what about, you know, extending that community even more broadly to keep pushing this agenda? I haven't really thought it through as much. You know, I think would be great to hear other people's views on what we could do more to continue with those kind of ideas. Certainly, I think research would be part of it, because even if we had something like a work stream with targets, I think there would be bullet points we would think about. I think research would be one, as well as the other elements we discussed, like participation, coordination, funding, and capacity. Yeah, but I'd be very interested to hear creative ideas from other people in this webinar.
Fantastic. We've got to the point where we can start taking questions that have been slowly piling up in the chat boxes from the audience. We've got a lot of really great questions, and so me, Anila, and Andonis are going to take it in turns to select the ones we want to ask. And it may be, Anila, that you also want to give your perspective on some of the questions, or ask whatever questions you'd like. But I was going to start with a theme that's emerged is really about this question we've already discussed about what constitutes meaningful partnership. And there are at least a couple of questions that are questioning whether we need a new paradigm of partnership. So Georgia Cole, for instance, asks, to what extent can the global refugee response architecture, which largely rests on a humanitarian imperative to help, with all its implicit power hierarchies, actually shift towards a meaningful form of partnership and local ownership? Do we need a new theory of change that doesn't involve giving capacity or giving opportunities for self-reliance? So I think there's a question about whether we need to change the paradigm of partnership from a giving imperative to help as outsiders towards something else. And similarly, another academic colleague, Dawn Chatty, says real partnerships are not just service providers for international agencies, has been very difficult to set into effect in the Levant region, for example. Are we going to get a new model of partnership, and can real partnership be effective? So I suppose the question that's emerging there is, can partnership be effective if it's given top down by a humanitarian architecture, or do we need to think about what partnership means and where it comes from, and how do we strike that balance? And we touched on that, but I think there's a degree of critical engagement with that and whether we need a new model. So it'd be very interesting to get your reflections on that.
Absolutely. I've read a fascinating report by the ODI that only came out recently, that 1% of all resources that change hands in an emergency context actually come through international donors, which I don't have the link to, but it's a fascinating read. So I think what that showed is that this is already happening. You know, this sense of the hierarchies of giving is almost irrelevant when you think about all of the work that is already happening. And I think it's very small-minded if it still happens, which unfortunately it may do, of large organizations thinking that it's coming from the approach of giving in partnerships, because that isn't the case. And that's why, and for us, we call our course the capacity sharing course, because we've learned probably far more from it than we've ever been able to share ourselves. And so if you don't come into it with that approach, if you come into it with a giving approach, then it's not only wrong, but the wrong approach operationally, but I just think it's also misguided in terms of what's really happening. So those hierarchies have to change. And I think probably there are multiple angles from which it can change, from the bottom up, so to speak, of what the GRN are doing is the best, but also from the donor angle, I think is an important way. I think that this has been happening too. I think large organizations that have the bulk of their spending in headquarters in the global north are finding it harder to fund that and are having to shift staff and actually then recruit staff in countries of operation, because it's being harder to fund global headquarters. And so that's a sign that at the donor level, there is a recognition that you can't just have all the decision makers in a capital city in the global north seeing their role as being givers of humanitarian aid, but that much more needs to happen still.
This is such a deeply philosophical question. I'm not sure from which angle to kind of answer it or tackle it, because I understand the ideologies behind it, but I also want to highlight the deep meaning behind what a partnership looks like, especially at UNHCR. So with UNHCR, our partners are usually either implementing partners, and that is what we are trying to achieve for refugee-led organizations, right? In that sense, they would still need to abide by the certain regulations, the certain classifications that any other implementing partner abides and lives by. But then we go back to the same conversation where in order for us to get there, we need to support them to get there, not just as UNHCR, but as an international humanitarian community. When we see the chance to support with capacity building, we must do it. When we see the chance to give workshops, and I was reading this in the chat box, to give workshops on legal representation, legal rights, how can you register, ABCs of registration, ABCs of launching your own refugee-led organization, we should make that happen. In the sense of shifting the paradigm, I think first let us better understand the mechanisms at hand from both sides with regards to both UNHCR and refugee-led organizations before we start demanding for radical change. And this is just personally speaking, and maybe this is why my answer might not be the best to a lot of people. I'm not a radical person, because I believe a good, sustainable change comes with a slow but steady effort to get to know one another, to better understand the activities of one another, to tolerate one another. And I think that is already in the works. Will there be a need to shift in a pragmatic and create that paradigm shift in the future? To be quite honest, I'm not sure, because we're still exploring that through the report and through these discussions. But just speaking to the basics of this conversation today, how can we become equal partners to begin with? And then let us demand for the change. Let us agree on that together, and as a global humanitarian community with UNHCR's involvement, and then we can demand for what that looks like afterwards. But that's over for me.
Yes, I'm as we are just trying to figure it out, which question should take, because so many questions all are very important. And Dana, I just go back to you again, a question which I selected from Alina Mora. She's saying, if credibility and trust are to be built, legal empowerment is also needed for refugees. Hopefully, conceive an accountability practice. Would you agree? And what other strategies are there to build trust from RLO? Do you know any good practices so far within UNHCR?
So I actually saw this question and I really liked it, because it did come up in my research quite a lot, and I'm on it right now. I think there's definitely a need for credibility building and trust building on many levels, not just amongst UNHCR, RLOs, refugees, but beyond that, on a global humanitarian level. When we ask each other's questions, questioning systems or questioning efforts or intentions, I don't think that is the right place to have these conversations, unless it is done in a constructive way, which is what I really enjoyed about Elina's question. Beyond that, yes, there is a need for legal empowerment. I think refugees should know their rights, and they should better understand that they have the right to be protected, well taken care of, and they have the right to meaningful refugee participation in deciding their future and what they do on the field level as well. And I think my colleagues in the protection department will have more to say on that, so I will not delve into it too much. But in essence, what I also found, and I'll offer a counter argument here, is when refugees have become empowered in a host community, and I've seen this in the research, this is purely from the research, the question that has been posed is they have felt sometimes that they have not felt safe, or that this can compromise their security. So this is a question that I really struggled with as well, because at the end of the day, what UNHCR aims to do is to protect refugees, to protect them and ensure their well-being within that transition. So what happens when you're faced with that crossroad as well? A good examples, what other strategies are there to build trust from RLOs? Good examples, I would say, is definitely the relationship I have had personally with the GRN and the Jumpstart refugees headed by Mustafa Alio. Open, frank dialogue that is constructive on both ends, commitment from both ends, always providing the necessary documents. If you have a concern or if you need support, you communicate that. I think that relationship has been very healthy, and just to kind of continue building on that will be fruitful, ever more so, because it is a process. But I hope that answered Elina's question, and thank you, Elina, for being so constructive with it.
So another question that speaks to relations between international organizations and the other actors involved in the localization project, so to speak, comes from Jeff Crisp at the Refugee Studies Center. He says, can UNHCR maintain good relations with host governments and at the same time develop close partnerships with RLOs? Is there any tension between the two objectives? And if so, how can it be, or if so, can it be resolved? So Dana, perhaps you have some perspectives from the UNHCR side of things, and Edmund, from your many years of operating in Kenya and Uganda, you probably have some observations to reflect on as well.
Okay, and that's a really good question, and it's a difficult one. I think some of the implications in that are maybe around, you know, the challenges of hosting refugees, particularly, you know, the top 10 hosting countries are themselves, pretty much all of them are developing countries, and it is very political. I think there's no doubt about that, and that goes all the way up to funding mechanisms at the government level of large donor countries as well as the hosting countries. My only observations, and this is purely anecdotal to Kenya and Uganda, is that maybe some of the brokering and the negotiating hasn't been done as well as it could have been. And that's not just from the perspective of refugee-led organizations. I think it's also for the whole refugee hosting process. But of course, given that donor organizations have quite a big influence if they want to push for change and push for more refugee-led implementation rather than maybe certain, like, all funds going to certain national organizations, that comes into it. I think maybe that there could be more done to look at, to leverage opportunities. I think maybe Alex's book Refuge gives some great examples of that. You know, if you can look at the bigger picture, it's not just about protection. Protection is interesting, but what about economic opportunities, diplomatic opportunities? And clearly, I don't have any tangible experience in this area myself, but my observation, having been in Kenya for 9 years, and unfortunately some of the people doing some of this negotiating maybe didn't stay for so long. Just watching different processes of these conversations going around, is that maybe there's more that could be brought to the table, so that maybe the donor organizations can leverage more for better ways of working, rather than being so vulnerable to the political things. This is complicated and not an easy job for anyone, but it still needs to be discussed.
Thank you for that, Edmund. I want to break down the question. I have it in front of me. I want to break it down just so I understand the process it is implying. Can UNHCR maintain good relations with host governments and at the same time develop close partnerships with refugee-led organizations? I'm not sure what the background that Jeff Crisp has with this question on why that should not be the case. But through my research, I believe yes, and in a lot of the host governments, it could be the case where those two can be maintained, unless in some cases where the refugee-led organizations don't have the legal right to be established. And that is when the protection element of UNHCR must step in and be emphasized. I mean, there could be tension between the two objectives. I think only if that were to come into play, or if we were to be involved with legal issues. But I think beyond that, what refugee-led organizations offer is really good work on a grassroots level that is meaningful to the communities that they serve and are a part of. I don't think that should be an issue for the host communities, especially since they are serving the communities they belong to most of the time, or even supporting or including host communities in that process of support and growth and service. So I don't think that should be an issue. But as I said again, and I'll conclude with this, if it were to be the issue where they would have legal barriers, again, we must emphasize the protection element of UNHCR's work. And of course, UNHCR is always eager to step in and make sure that is always attained.
One area, I suppose, where one could imagine a possible tension between the preferences of the host government and the support for refugee-led organizations is, I suppose, sometimes in the privileging of national organizations, and particularly national organizations as implementing partners. I don't know whether that's what Jeff had in mind, but that's certainly something we've seen a little bit in our research. And there's a related question that's come from Robert Hakiza, who was part of the seminar last week. And he says, hello, Dana. In my experience, it has been difficult for UNHCR to work directly with RLOs as implementing partners. How do we change this? And he followed that up with a question saying, well, in addition to that, one role that UNHCR might play is to encourage its existing implementing partners to work with RLOs. So I suppose the question there is it possible for RLOs to aspire to be implementing partners, and what has to happen for that to be realistic?
That is a broad question, because that is essentially 2 minutes of an entire report that I have been working on for the past 6 to 8 months. But I think I understand the sentiment. So just to answer the first part of the question, there has been in the past collaborations between UNHCR and refugee-led organizations through small grants, through support. And I was surprised to learn that Edmund's project won the Innovation Award in 2019, where they were given a grant to work on a project with refugee-led organizations. So that is already in the works. There is work being done in smaller phases and smaller grants. But can a refugee-led organization aspire to be an implementing partner? I think with COVID-19, we have been forced to become flexible on all fronts as a humanitarian sector. We have been forced to become more flexible with funding mechanisms. We have been more eager to work with local actors simply because that is what is demanded. But we have also been eager to stay and deliver on our promises, stay and deliver on our work. Yes, they can become implementing partners. Today, probably difficult, but in the near future, I do see it happening. The GRN is a great example of how much work and effort they have put into the process of growth that they've had since 2017, 2018, coming now to 2020, hosting conversations online with such grand attendance and deep conversations, and then growing further into establishing governance, establishing structures that will be able to then turn into implementing mechanisms. I think it is possible, but at the same time, we must acknowledge all of the challenges at hand from both sides, better understand them, better articulate them together, and then work through that process.
Donna, I know that in preparation for this seminar, we had a call, and you said that you were really interested in hearing some comments from the audience as well. I wonder, since we have about 10 minutes left, whether yourself and Edmund would like to ask for any particular feedback, or if there are any areas of interest that you feel could be explored a little bit more, so that they've got some time to respond to that, and then we can go to another question in the meantime.
No, Dana, you were saying in the call that you might sort of throw out some questions to the audience. Do you have anything specific? I think I've shared a few possible ideas of my thoughts, and basically I'd be keen to just hear feedback on that, and but additional ideas. But do you have more specific questions you'd like to ask?
I think what I'm eager to see beyond this call is more interaction with refugee-led organizations. As I mentioned, I'm still working on the mapping, and the mapping is not going to end with me or once I'm done with the report itself. More and more refugee-led organizations are stepping up onto the global level, which is at least where I operate. And it would be very interesting for me to hear their work, start collecting stories of best practices. I think that's what I'm eager to hear. Best practices, what has been done, what has worked, and that will serve better on how we move forward. I'm happy to answer questions all day, but I think what I would really like to hear or read more of is what has worked. What have you done that has worked so far, even if it's with UNHCR or with other implementing partners of yours, and maybe learn some more from that, dive deeper into that, dismantle that, and then see how that would be implemented in the future moving forward.
Great. So just from a logistical front, folks can feed in their comments, and we'll be able to save this chat, and you can disseminate it to anybody that's interested in it. We'll also be sharing Dana and Edmund's emails afterwards if you want to have follow-up conversations. And as mentioned earlier, we'll try to figure out what to do exactly with this list of attendees so that we can keep conversations going. One thing that Alex had mentioned in our preparatory call is that it would be great to move beyond just the 6 seminars that we have planned to a 7th seminar, where perhaps we convene a workshop and explore these issues in a little bit more detail, and try to get a little bit more traction around the problem solving. So once we finish all of these seminars, we'll have a better idea and orientation around how we can actually formulate those workshops in a way that will be constructive. Sorry for the tangent, but if Anila or Alex have any questions to feed from the attendees.
I have a question for everyone, and especially for our speaker panelists from Dana and Edmund, because I'm also a founder of a woman refugee-led organization, New Women Connector, where we are trying to give a voice for refugee women, which that's why I felt when we are preparing for this session, I felt I really want to ask this question, because refugee-led is one barrier, and when it's becomes woman refugee-led, it's become like a double barrier. So far, this is what I am trying to face, but I'm keep trying to create a platform where we put refugee women voices there on the, to show their resilience, to show their problem, but also recommendations and mechanism they are working with. And especially this COVID-19, the gender-based violence is going very high, and that's why I'm asking like everyone if they have any ideas of what we are trying to achieve here and how to make more flexibility for refugee women-led organization as well. This is to make also put it there in a bucket list, in a wish list, how when we are talking about refugee-led organization, how we can work with as an implemented partner with refugee women-led organization is also very important. So this is question mix comments I want to share.
I totally agree with you, and Anila, it's a really big challenge. And if you look at the 12 RLOs we work with, none of them are exclusively led by women. And although all of them have women on their governance boards and in their management teams, it's I think in almost no cases a majority. And I think the approach has got to be more transformative rather than just having tokenistic targets. Like for us, we've been lucky to have the experience of in one or two cases actually starting right from scratch with the RLO, right from the very beginning when they didn't even have a name. I think if we were to do that again, that might be an approach that we would take, would be to identify either a women's group that we want to form and grow their impact. So it has to take systemic shift in that direction rather than just saying, and this is a challenge I think in all over, is saying we're going to have 50% target on the board, and then it just doesn't happen. So I think it's got to be more strategic, and again, it needs more time. It's not something that can be done in a 1-year grant or a 3-month project. So I do agree with you that it's a big challenge.
Just to answer to that really quickly, I'll start by saying that UNHCR's AGD approach, the age, gender, and diversity approach, really does look into that, acknowledges that, and recognizes the importance of the involvement of women, diverse groups, and different age groups as well in their consultation processes. And beyond that, Anila, I think what you're doing, if I can say just personally speaking, is great work. I have seen you involved ever since we've met. I've seen you involved in many activities. I've seen a lot of great women role models in the refugee community by your side, such as Najiba, who great, kudos to her as well, to her efforts, and Shaza, and other colleagues at the GRN who have worked really hard to be the female role models and have that voice be heard of women refugee experiences and how that looks like, because it is one thing to have a refugee experience, but how do you personalize that, whether it is as a woman, as someone of a certain age group, and someone with a certain background. But I think one thing that I would really recommend is to continue documenting those experiences online, so that, for example, if we were to seek out these stories or seek out that kind of support, it would be available to us online on a platform with refugee-led recognition. I think that is another challenge that a lot of refugee-led organizations have faced, making their work seen, making their work accessible to the global or to the regional or national levels. A lot of it is grassroots and well-intended indeed, but how do you find out about them if you're not in the field itself, or you're not directly involved or in touch, as I am with you, with their activities? So just to make sure that the work is always documented, the work is always present online or available to be accessed, would be a huge favor. And I really look forward to following up with you on that, Anila, and to find out more about this work. Hats off to you.
We're almost coming to the end of our time. And I think what we're going to do, Dana and Edmund, is come to you for some final words. But before we do that, perhaps just to stimulate that, I'm just going to read some of the comments we've received in the chat box. In addition to questions, there have been a few comments. And so just reading them out can give voice to a few people who have been listening, but also it might stimulate something in your reflections. So Ali Eldin says, as a refugee myself, I could argue that localization is the most important area that UNHCR is required to work on. Refugee-led organizations and host communities are the most supportive groups for refugees, and it's not just international NGOs. Barbara says, building capacities in RLOs often leads to INGOs brain draining that capacity with more attractive positions and career prospects. There has to be an understanding that the capacity that is built to strengthen the RLO and the community can be done in a sustainable way. Diana says, I wonder what UNHCR can do for the work RLOs are already doing in their communities. If we focus too much on the relationship between UNHCR and RLOs, do we run the risk of extending unnecessary bureaucracy and delays, and also potentially politicizing RLOs, even if UNHCR aims to keep its neutrality? The work may not always be regarded as such. That's just a selection of some of the many thoughts we've received from a really live and interesting chat. And so I hope everyone will have a chance to read all of the comments in the chat, and we'll aim to document them afterwards. But those are just some of the comments. Don't feel the need to necessarily respond to those, Dana and Edmund, but just in general, it would be great to have your final closing comments. So much of what you've said so far has been really inspiring, but do you have any final words of inspiration for us?
No, yeah, those are some really good points. And I think it's just the richness of all the comments coming through in the chat that we could talk about this for hours. I think that just goes to show that we do need to continue this conversation. You know, this is really exciting. We've got momentum building with, even from this webinar series, we've gone from 200 to 500. Let's continue to spread the word. Let's get more people next week. Let's get even more for the seventh in the series, the interactive session that we hope to have. And let's broaden the conversation, the audience. Let's bring in other actors in very different fields to be part of this. I think those are my closing words. I just, you know, all of us on this call, however many hundred, if we all reached out to bring more people in who do believe in this and would take this seriously, then I think we can have a really big impact. So that's my sort of call to action. And yeah, thanks so much again for this opportunity to be part of a really great conversation. Really looking forward to next week.
I echo Edmund's closing remarks. I think just to close, I want to ensure that UNHCR is. I want to ensure that you know that UNHCR is committed to localization. As I had mentioned at the beginning, we have reached our 25% of local funding. We have also established over 50% of our partners as national NGO partners. So we are there. I think the question is now, how do we better support refugee-led organizations, which is a valuable niche, a discussion that is growing now, especially with COVID-19. Just to clarify a little bit more on that, and this might be interesting, but if you look at the chats, indeed, a lot of questions were directed to me, but there were a lot of examples that were so enriching. I mean, imagine the power of that all being shared best practices, putting that together and kind of working from that and working forward. That's the kind of dialogue where I believe harnessing would be a lot more constructive moving forward. And I'm more than happy to continue supporting Alex, you and Edmund and Anila and the rest of the colleagues on this call moving forward. I remain committed, so does UNHCR, to the localization agenda, to the grand bargain, and to better understanding how we can best work with RLOs and partner with them as equal partners to ensure meaningful refugee participation that is sustained, that is systematic, and that is fruitful for all. Thank you.
Anila, any last thoughts from you?
No, thank you so much, and I really enjoyed today. And as I said in the start, meaningful participation is really close to our work, close to our heart. And when we are sharing our experience, sometimes we do not feel comfortable telling the story again and again. But we do understand if we are not sharing our story, because our story is a perspective, our story is a reflection of the system, our story is a reflection of reality, what we are facing still. Like I'm in Netherlands, and all the difficulties which we are facing, we are also highlighting the gaps and also bringing the recommendation. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed and looking forward for our further next week discussion. Thank you so much.
And just to close from a Refugee Studies Centre perspective, I want to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, Anila for co-moderating, Edmund and Dana. I think what's really remarkable for me is the really open and constructive way in which we're able to have this dialogue. For me, having UNHCR and an international NGO and one of the leaders from the refugee-led network, and so many diverse participants in the audience engaging in the chat box shows the potential that I think Dana has really reiterated of a constructive dialogue where we can move forwards by trying to understand different perspectives, trying to understand the contributions and challenges faced by refugee-led organizations, but also trying to be empathetic towards the challenges that international organizations face and the challenges that international NGOs face. And if we can all take a little bit of the tone of this conversation of really constructive engagement and dialogue, then I think certainly that gives me a degree of optimism that we can start to create much more meaningful participation. So as panelists, you've given me a little bit of hope, and I hope that extends to everyone and that we can build momentum from these types of conversations in the way that Dana, Edmund and Anila, you've really articulated so clearly and in such inspiring ways. So thank you again to everyone who's joined us. And we look forward to continuing the conversation again next week when we'll shift to funders and look at the role of philanthropic organizations and private foundations and the role that they can play in supporting RLOs. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.